Today's guest is none other than Professor Marandi. I would spend time introducing him, but you're clicking on this video not because you know me, but because you know him. So without further ado, I'd like to hop right into it. So, Professor Marandi, obviously, the last 10 days have been pretty dramatic and heated in Syria, primarily in the Suweida region in the southwest. We know that the IDF bombed and attacked Jolani's forces, Ahmed al-Sharah's forces, whatever name you want to give him, as they went to try and either conquer Suweida or reestablish control over Suweida after some skirmishes. There's debate and dispute over how this happened. But to me, the bigger story is that Israel bombed them and prevented them from exerting any kind of influence or control. And in the time since now, there's been a lot of chaos and bloodshed on both sides between the forces in Suweida and either Jalani's forces, the Syrian state forces, or local Bedouin tribes. It's kind of chaotic at this point. What can you tell us about what has happened, why it's happening, and what we need to take away from this?
It's very obvious that the Israeli regime strikes with impunity. And even though Ashara or Jolani uh, kissed the ring and he sent all sorts of messages to the Israelis saying that our enemies are Iran and Hezbollah, he's saying that we are friends and we have similar enemies. And while he's been negotiating with them through the Turks primarily, and the Emiratis, but mostly the Turks, the last being in Azerbaijan, which is a close ally of the Israeli regime. Despite all that, the Israelis show that they uh, do not respect anyone, even if they are submissive or obedient or friendly. It doesn't matter. And that, I think, is something that countries across the region should take note of. And I have a feeling that some are uh, taking note of this fact. So this was an unprovoked attack. Uh, Al Qaeda or the Syrian armed forces, whatever one would like to call them, they have never fired a single bullet at the Israelis. In fact, they were the first to get support from the Israelis during the Dirty War when they had bases alongside the Syrian Golan. The Israeli regime would provide them with funding, with ammunition. They would treat their injured when the Syrian government would attack their positions, the positions of Al Qaeda or um, the Nusra Front later on. The Israelis would bomb the Syrian army. They would use helicopters, sometimes airplanes, and sometimes artillery to strike. So they were the first to get support. And yet the Israelis are aggressive to anyone they feel they need to bomb. And that just shows that peace with the Israeli regime is simply impossible. It is not achievable because of the very nature of the regime itself.
So now there are people who are pointing out that Israel has bombed the Syrian forces, and now are saying, you told us that Al Qaeda and Israel were on the same team, but now we have evidence that they are not. How would you explain to people that are confused about what exactly the criticism is of the relationship between, the forces that received support in the dirty war, whether it's direct or indirect, from Israel and the United States?
Well, that's wishful thinking on behalf of people. I think it's very obvious that the Israeli regime doesn't care who's in charge anywhere. They want weak regimes, they want compliant regimes, and they want fragmented regimes. They will never tolerate a strong Jordan, no matter how uh, friendly Jordan is to the Israelis. They will never tolerate a strong Egypt or a strong Turkey, no matter how friendly they are or how much trade they do. The Israelis will undermine anyone in their, especially neighboring countries, especially neighboring countries. So Al Qaeda, of course, we all know that they were supported by the West in Afghanistan. They were supported by the West in Libya. They were supported by the West in the dirty war in Syria. In the case of Syria, it's WikiLeaks has shown the best evidence uh, that they've shown us the smoking gun that Jake Sullivan, in his email to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, he said Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. So there's no doubt about that relationship. As I said, there's no doubt about the material relationship that existed between the Israeli regime and Al Qaeda and Daesh, by the way, and ISIS as well, alongside the Syrian Golan. But that doesn't mean that if you cooperate with the Israeli regime, that they will not sacrifice you. Those parts of the Druze community that were cooperating with the Israeli regime. And by the way, the reason why the West and the Israelis promoted Al Qaeda and other extremists and helped them come to power is because they're the best tools to bring the destruction of Syria, because they are utterly intolerant. They're Takfiri. And so all of the communities, including the Sunni communities, will be marginalized and pressure will be put upon them. So among the Druze, there are those who reject cooperation with the Israeli regime, and the Druze community has a long history of resisting the Israeli regime and the French before them. And there are those who, of course, are collaborators, and they're, of course, traitors. And then there's a third group which, out of desperation, may tilt towards the Israeli regime because of the Takfiris. That is not acceptable. But you have, when you look at it within that context, you see why this sort of thing happens. But does the Israeli regime uh, really support the Druze? Do they like the Druze? Do they consider them to be uh, non-Amalek? Of course not. They too, when the time comes and if necessarily, will be bombed and they will be crushed. In fact, the Israelis have done a good job in allowing uh, the Al Qaeda forces or the Syrian government to move into Suweida and to kill people without doing much in response. They could have hit much harder, but they allowed many innocent Druze, women, and children to be slaughtered. We saw a lot of things that I don't want to say on TV, but I mean, on your program, but we know about the issue of sex slaves. We know about the burning of people, a lot of burning people's bodies. We know that people are just taken and gunned down or forced to jump off of buildings. The Israeli regime allowed that to happen, and of course, within the Druze, they've done the same sort of atrocity. Elements within the Druze have done the same sort of atrocities. This is not a; these are not crimes committed by one side. But in any case, the Israeli regime has no sympathy for the Druze. It has no sympathy for the Arabs in general, and for anyone who is not a Zionist, because anyone who is not a Zionist is not among the chosen people.
So you've stated for us that Israel's intention is to fragment Syria, to keep it weak and divided and destroyed. I'd like to ask you, why is it that the United States would allow the sanctions to be lifted? Is it because Israel, like we know that Netanyahu supposedly told Trump, or Trump declared when Netanyahu came to visit, that I'm lifting the sanctions off Syria, and Bibi's the reason why. He also credited MBS. Both are probably true. They both probably approved of it. But if Israel's intention is to like weaken and fragment and destroy Syria, why would they also be comfortable with the lifting of sanctions? Is it because they know that not a whole lot of investment is going to come to a place that we have divided and fragmented anyway? Or is it just another form of control for them? What is it in your view?
I think it's a combination of things, including what you've just said. But the United States keeps getting more concessions from Ashara or Jolani and the the people in charge through giving uh, promises and limited concessions. But at the end of the day, uh, we see what's happening on the ground, and that is the total destruction of national unity. That is the end result of all this. And let me give you ask an even better question, perhaps, or at least a question that's just as valid. Why is it that the Al-Qaeda government in Damascus believed that they could go to Suweida. Why did they believe that they could go there and take over? Because they were given assurances. And then we were told that there was a big misunderstanding. How could there have been a big misunderstanding? They were sitting at the negotiating table. They've been negotiating for weeks and months together. They spent a lot of time together in the in Baku in the Republic of Azerbaijan. It's not like you and I met at a street corner and you told me a couple of sentences and I went home and I misunderstood what you had to say. These were complicated negotiations. There's no misunderstanding. It's obvious that they were luring the uh, the government forces or the Al Qaeda forces or whatever uh, to the south, and then they bombed them, and then they gave their those within the Druze community false assurances of support. And when they needed the support during the height of the killing, they didn't give the support that they needed. In other words, they played off one against another. They
Mm.
bomb, they mislead, they lie, they cheat, and they steal, as someone very famous once said.
Pure evil. it doesn't
Pure
get
evil,
it doesn't get more evil than that. Um,
pure
so,
evil, pure evil.
so speaking of what took place in Azerbaijan, what exactly were they discussing, and what was the point of it? Was it entirely to focus on Suweida, or were there broader negotiations taking place? Were they discussing the possibility of normalization? What was taking place in Azerbaijan exactly?
Well, I don't have behind the scenes information, but these negotiations have been going on for a long time, and the Turks have been saying that they've been working very hard to bring the two sides together, which is very sad in itself for anyone to even attempt for such a thing at a time when a genocide is being carried out in Gaza, while starvation is reaching uh, a critical point. One would imagine that Mr. Erdogan would cut off ties with the Israeli regime, stop the trade, stop the oil flow, stop helping them in any way or form, and start supporting resistance on all fronts. But again, he's doing the exact opposite as he's always been doing. And so the Turks have been saying they've been trying to bring the two sides together. And of course, the negotiations in Baku, which were very recent, were at the highest level. uh, Shara was in Baku, so he was obviously supervising those negotiations. He knew exactly what was being said, and of course, all of this has to do with normalization, the recognition of the Israeli regime, something that would be the best possible outcome. But that doesn't mean that after recognition that the Israelis will ever allow Syria to thrive. That's not going to happen. Is Jordan thriving? Is Egypt thriving? Is Lebanon has Lebanon ever been thriving under any government, the pro-Western governments in Lebanon, such as the current government? No, because the Israeli regime must rule supreme. Lebanon has no air defenses. The Lebanese armed forces have no ability to defend the country. They will never allow that, no matter what sort of relationship there is. And of course, I don't want to even go into Jordan or Egypt. So basically, what Jolani and Al Qaeda are doing is that they are moving towards legitimizing the Israeli regime, but the Israeli regime is never going to allow Syria to thrive as a result.
Yeah, that was kind of my concern when they were engaging in these kind of concessions and negotiations. I thought, it's a bit idealistic and naive to think that they're going to allow you to exist and gain strength over 20, 30, 40 years, whatever people are saying, like trying to justify the relationship. And they say, we're just buying time, buying time. But Israel is not going to allow you to gain strength. And so I thought it was a bit naive. But then seeing, the sanctions get lifted, I was a bit confused. But seeing now what they've just done in Suweida, it's clear that even with the lifting of sanctions, they're still going to, maintain their dominance over Syria and ensure that it never gains any kind of stability that could lead to their strength, that could pose a challenge or a security threat to the state of Israel. You've brought up Erdogan and Turkey, and a lot of Syrians were expecting Turkey to step up and protect them. And apparently, they had like some sort of defense pact. They were going to have a base put in Syria, but the Israelis did not let that happen, and they're probably never going to allow that to happen. Can you explain to my audience what the relationship is between Israel and Turkey? Is Erdogan a Zionist, or is he just like other leaders in the region who view the Israelis as gatekeepers to the West and can kind of give Turkey some kind of benefit that they are willing to take right now? So it's like a temporary kind of convenient relationship. What exactly is Israel and Turkey doing together, and which direction is this going in?
No, Erdogan is not a Zionist. That's obvious. But Erdogan is not someone who's going to make any sacrifices for the Palestinian people. Erdogan uses the Palestinian cause to gain support at home, and he talks the talk, but that's as far as he goes. He sometimes he gives Palestinian scholarships so that they can study in Turkey, and he provides platforms for conferences, but he is never going to bullet to Hamas or Islamic Jihad or any of the resistance groups inside or outside of Lebanon. He is a member of NATO, and he has a very good relationship with the United States. If you're going to have a good relationship with the United States, you're not going to do anything meaningful for the Palestinian people. That's clear as day. Otherwise, the United States would sanction you and harm you and undermine you at a turn, just like they've been doing with Iran for the last 47, 48 years. So Mr. Erdogan is looking for his own interests. He wants to build a mini Ottoman Empire. He wants to have influence, at least in parts of Syria and parts of Lebanon, parts of Iraq, and in the Caucasus. And that's why his interests, in many respects, uh, are the same as that of the Israeli regime. Anything that, for example, the axis of resistance, which is directed at the Israeli regime, he seeks to undermine because anything that prevents his expansionist policies in the region would be harmful. And also, he does deals with the West. When he, at the end of the day, the United States was behind the destruction of Syria, Operation Timber Sycamore, just like in Libya. But the most important, uh, let's say, country that brought about the destruction of Syria was Turkey. So the United States gains concessions, or sorry, the Erdogan gets concessions from the United States by facilitating the dirty war, and then he became a part of it, and he became, and of course Qatar funded ISIS and Al Qaeda more than anyone else. So did other countries, uh, oil and gas rich countries in the Persian Gulf. They all funded ISIS and Al Qaeda and Jaish al Islam and other extremist groups. But then gradually, some of them moved away from this policy. Uh, Mohammed bin Salman had his own objectives that were different from his predecessors, but it until now it's basically Qatar and Turkey. So there is friction between Turkey and the Israelis over Syria because they can both want a bigger piece of the cake. But anyone who is naive enough to think, after 22 months of genocide, a country that transports oil to the Israeli regime, a country that trades with the Israeli regime, a country till, I don't know now, but till just recently when I was at Istanbul airport, has direct flights with the Israeli regime, a country that has diplomatic relations with the Israeli regime. That country is going to support the resistance. That person is either very naive or that person is willfully closing his or her own eyes to reality.
I want to talk to you a little
And
bit.
let me add one thing. Let me
Go,
add one thing.
go ahead.
These countries, Erdogan's regime, the Jordanian regime, Mohammed bin Zayed's regime, all of these regimes that refuse to punish Israel, that continue to do business as usual with Netanyahu, they impede the marginalization of the Israeli regime. Why should, I mean, of course, morally speaking, everyone should boycott the Israelis and marginalize them. But if you looked at it from the perspective of many governments across Africa or Latin America or Asia, they would ask you, why should I cut off ties with the Israeli regime when Turkey and the Emirates and Jordan and Egypt have trade relations, when they have embassies, when they have uh, flights, when they cooperate at the intelligence level, and so on and so forth. What response can we give to countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia who may have an incentive to impose sanctions on the Israeli regime, but to look at what neighboring countries are doing? So, in a sense, not only are these countries, regimes, helping the Israeli regime, they're also impeding the global resistance from putting pressure on the Israeli regime through countries outside of the region.
There's no doubt it's absolutely shameful. The entire region is complicit in it, especially in the Gulf, Turkey, as you've mentioned. It's Morocco. I mean, it's unbelievable the extent that Muslim countries will go. I mean, the way that they try to assist Israel in getting around the Yemeni blockade, by using this overland route. I mean, it's just absolutely shameful. I want to talk to you a little bit about this concept of strategic sequencing, because I think it's interesting, to zoom out and see like this grand chessboard, and you see the Russia Ukraine conflict, you see Iran, and there's a lot of discussion about China and Taiwan. The United States is obviously very concerned about China uh, rising and potentially overtaking them economically. And there's a lot of discussion in Washington about this pivot to China, this pivot to Asia. They view China as the juicy prize, as Carl Zaha says, and they're kind of freaking out now because in Russia, they're taking more towns and more villages, and the Ukrainian defense line is about to collapse. And so I wanted to get your perspective and explain to us how the Iran war fits into this broader chessboard, this grander battlefield, where the United States is trying to basically, pin down Russia in Ukraine, go for Iran, so that they can finally take on China and basically fight all of these perceived enemies one on one.
Well, obviously, the United States is overstretched, and so is NATO. And it is not just fighting Iran and the resistance and the Palestinian people in West Asia, but it is, as you pointed out, fighting the Russians. But it's not just China, it's waging a trade war against much of the world. So the United States has problems across the board. And at home, things are not much better. You know much more about the United States than I do. But the rising gap, the growing gap between rich and poor in the United States, the collapse of the middle class, the um, the fact that so many young people are dissatisfied, including with foreign policy and the genocide, the Holocaust in Gaza, but also because of issues like Epstein and how both parties cover up the criminal behavior of the elites, and of course the fact that the Israeli regime is very much a part of this criminal behavior. So people, it doesn't go unnoticed that girls are raped in the United States for the sake of the Israeli regime enhancing its influence so that it can slaughter and rape in Palestine and in West Asia as well. This is something that a growing number of Americans are seeing. Younger people, growing them recognize this. So all of these problems are accumulating, and that makes it more difficult for the United States to confront and defeat any of its so-called adversaries because it's simply uh, too much spread out to be able to focus on any one of these problems, which it created for itself. We didn't have to have this situation in West Asia. We didn't have to have the situation in Ukraine. We didn't have to have wars. All of this is what the United States has brought upon itself, and the United States has acted as, and NATO and the Israeli regime has, they have acted as catalysts to bring the global South closer to one another. In other words, this convergence of interests that we see growing among non-Western countries, both regionally and globally, uh, the behavior of the West has been a catalyst to increase the pace of that growing recognition and that convergence in reality.
If you can describe the mood for us in Iran, it's been quite some time now since the war. Uh, People have completed their mourning, etc., and Iran is essentially preparing for another round. So, what is the mood of the people? Are they feeling the crushing weight of the sanctions? Are they nervous about another round, or is pride and morale still high in the public?
Pride and morale is very high. The Iranians are uh, very confident about their capabilities, and they feel that they won this war, and they have good evidence to believe that. It was Netanyahu who literally begged for a ceasefire. Trump approached the Iranians through his friends in the Persian Gulf region and asked for a ceasefire. The Iranians refused a cessation of hostilities. And then Trump had to give concessions, and he came back to the Iranians. One, of course, was something which Trump himself admitted. I don't know why he did it, but he said that the Iranians could sell their oil to China. That was one of the concessions. He didn't have to state it, and I still don't understand why he did. But after receiving a number of concessions, some of them apparently have to do, from my understanding, although I'm not privy to anything uh, that's been discussed behind closed doors, but my understanding is some of those concessions uh, may have to do with Palestine. But in any case, I don't know the details, and I don't know how far these concessions went. But in any case, the fact that the Americans and the Israelis wanted an end to this showed that the Iranians had the upper hand. Now, some people say, then why didn't Iran continue? Because I see many people saying Iran should have continued for another 10 days. Well, first of all, Iran won the war, and I think that was enough. That was a clear message to the West. Steve Bannon said that the real issue here was that Israel was in Syria and Trump went to save Israel, the Israeli regime, through pursuing a cessation of hostilities. So Iran sent a message. Two, uh, war is destructive, and if you won the war, there's no need to have more of your citizens die uh, when you've already achieved your objective. Three, as I said, the Iranians gain concessions from the United States that will help strengthen itself and the axis of resistance and the resistance. Remember, whether some people like to admit it or not, the the existence of the resistance in Gaza today is due to their resilience, their courage, their ingenuity, but also because of the support that they receive from Iran. The general in charge of supporting Gaza was one of the people who was murdered by the Israeli regime in the initial strike. So, and of course, he was replaced, and Iran will continue to support Gaza and the Palestinian people and the axis of resistance. But it was due to the axis of resistance, Iran support, Hezbollah drawing troops away from Gaza for well over a year, making huge sacrifices, Yemen making huge sacrifices to increase the economic pressure on the regime, and so on. So, a stronger Iran means a stronger axis of resistance. And a final point is that Iran wants the global South to remain on the side of the axis of resistance. And therefore, Iran wants the global south to see the Israeli regime as the aggressor that it is, as the warmonger that it is. And it wants the world, meaning Russia, China, India, Brazil, BRICS, beyond BRICS, to see Iran and the resistance as the rational actor. We do not want to see the global economy collapse. We can do that, but we don't want that. We want the globe to, as we were discussing earlier, to tilt away from the West, to increase the convergence that's growing among global South countries, because that is the way to defeat the empire. And the Israeli regime, it is already a dying regime. It has lost any so-called what they call legitimacy in the eyes of the world, even though it had no legitimacy at any point. But it has lost its perceived legitimacy in the eyes of people across the world because of this Holocaust. And every day that goes by, this only gets worse. And the resistance through the Lebanese borders, through the Red Sea, and of course through the missiles that were fired from Iran in Palestine, they have inflicted huge damage on the regime, damage that is irreversible. People now know that the Israeli regime is not invincible. It is very vulnerable, and it is completely dependent on the West, which is also complicit in this genocide. So things are not going well for the Israeli regime. It is going downhill for the regime, and it will continue to go downhill until its ultimate demise.
Was having a discussion with a Syrian, and of course they were, listing for me the grievances they have against Iran in Syria. And one of the grievances they had was that they said that Iran was spreading prostitution and drugs in Syria as a way to destabilize the country and control it and spread, these divisive, corroding forces in society. And they brought up Zawaj al Mut'a. They said that this concept of temporary marriage in Shia Islam, Iran brought it to Syria and spread it throughout Syria in order to dismantle it and harm it, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't provide any examples. I don't know exactly what they did. Are you familiar with this criticism? Do you know why they say this? Are they talking about like, I mean, they make criticism all the time. Not this specific individual I was speaking to, but I've seen people claim that there are mut'a brothels, that Shias are like just setting up brothels for legal prostitution, et cetera, et cetera. Can you clarify for my audience, first of all, what zawaj al mut'a is Islamically, and why this criticism is made, and why you may not agree with it?
Well, this is not, I believe, a sincere criticism. I don't know who this friend of yours is, but this is basically projection. The Takfiris take sex slaves, and this is outrageous. And this is what the resistance tried to prevent. Hezbollah made great sacrifices in Syria, so did Iran, and so did others to prevent these Takfiris from taking control of the country. We knew that what happened in Suweida would happen. It was something we were saying all along. Look at the old speeches of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. He, in fact, predicted what would happen in Suweida and elsewhere. Uh, People who take sex slaves would obviously like to distract attention away from their crimes. People who consider all other people who are not like them as worthy of punishment and death, they are the closest to Zionism and Zionists as we can get. Their behavior is no different than the behavior of Zionist troops in Gaza. In fact, if you look at history, the only Islamic country that saved, that supported Sunni countries is Iran. Bosnia, when it was being destroyed, the only government that went there, gave assistance, sent people there, among whom some were martyred, was Iran. And Hezbollah went to Bosnia too. Was it a Shia country? Is it a Shia community today? No, but they made sacrifices because they deserved to live. It's not just Muslims. The Iranians supported the South Africans during the apartheid reign. Iran supports Venezuela and Cuba. Cuba is a communist country, but Iran supports it because it's being oppressed. In Palestine, the Iranians and the Axis of Resistance have been making sacrifices for decades for the sake of the Palestinian people. Who else is making sacrifices? Who is making sacrifices? The dirty war in Syria was started by the Americans in order to end the resistance in Palestine. Why? Because Syria was the country through which Iran was supporting the Palestinians. Before 2011, President Assad's relationship with President Erdogan and his family was much closer than his relationship with Iran. President Erdogan and his wife and former President Assad and his wife would go on vacation together. They were friends with one another. Iran didn't have that sort of relationship. Iran's business trade relationship with Syria was limited. The relationship was friendly, but we didn't have a big presence in the country. It was only after that Erdogan, in line with Operation Timber Sycamore, began to bring in ISIS and Al Qaeda forces from across the world, that in the middle of 2013, 2 years after the Dirty War started, and a year and a half after Jake Sullivan wrote that infamous email, that Hezbollah got involved in Syria, that Iran got involved in Syria, after tens of thousands of ISIS and Al Qaeda fighters entered the country, the same fighters that take sex slaves, the same fighters that burn people alive. We still see it today, but we also saw it back then. We all remember the scenes of people being lined up in orange jumpsuits. We're not stupid. We don't have the memories of fish. We remember these things. And we saw what happened over the last week. With regards to corruption, that is the ultimate corruption. But when it comes to temporary marriage in Islam, anyone who looks and reads about Islamic history will know that it exists. And it is, have you seen any brothels in Iran? Have you seen any brothels in Lebanon? Temporary marriage is to prevent corruption, and it is highly regulated. You see people going out together, men and women, and Islam regulates it. Now, they can caricature it all they want, but the reality is that what Islam does is that it tries to make the framework, especially in today's contemporary world, which is very different from the past, it tries to create mechanisms to prevent societies from becoming what the United States and Europe have turned into. It's sort of like another concept that is caricatured by these Takfiris. And that I think is even more interesting. And that is about taqiyya. Taqiyya is in the Quran. And one of probably the most important example of taqiyya is the story of Ammar ibn Yasir. When he became Muslim along with his parents were tortured to death. And he was tortured as well. And when he was tortured, they told him to insult the Holy Prophet. And he did. And some of the companions of the Prophet attacked him for that. But the Quran said otherwise. And the Prophet fully supported Ammar. That is taqiyya. It's when a gun is held to your head, and in order to preserve the life of your family or yourself, you can do that. You don't have to do that, but it is acceptable. Something which is completely logical. That is the taqiyya that the Quran speaks of and the taqiyya that we speak about. But ironically, the taqiyya of the Takfiris is very different. Their taqiyya is exactly the taqiyya that they attribute to others. They say, yes, Jolani wants to destroy Israel, but he's doing it by playing 5D chess. He's pretending to be their friend. Erdogan, he's pretending to be their friend, but he's really out to undermine them. And then I say to myself, that is the taqiyya that you are talking about and attributing to us, but the taqiyya that you are doing. We don't believe in such taqiyya. That is hypocrisy. That is dishonesty. And that is something that we always oppose. Those who are principled are the ones who stand for the Palestinian people and who take the punishment for doing so. These people ridiculed Hezbollah during the war. And after they made so many sacrifices, they would laugh and ridicule and try to humiliate them and their martyrs. But in southern Syria, these people didn't fire a bullet at the Israeli regime. And instead, they took sex slaves and they slaughtered ordinary people that they captured. So they're in no position to speak about morality and to speak about human rights and human dignity. But I am very proud to be supporting the axis of resistance. And I'm very proud to be supporting the Islamic Republic of Iran with all its flaws and shortcomings. And I think that anyone across the world, Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, who supports the resistance, they have much greater honor and dignity than any of these Takfiris or any of these regimes that do business and trade with the Israeli regime.
The second and last part of the question that I had, another aspect of the criticism was drug trade. So there's a lot of talk about Captagon. I don't exactly know what Captagon is. I've asked some friends who are Syrian who live in Syria, and they've told me that they've taken Captagon, that they take it to help study. It was like a cheap pharmaceutical that I guess the government produced as a form of revenue. Hezbollah apparently, this Syrian person told me that Hezbollah was like masters of a drug trade, and that's how they make their money. Um, is that true? Like, does Hezbollah sell Captagon? Is Captagon considered this very destructive drug that they're talking about? Why is this criticism made, to your knowledge?
It's obvious why the criticism is made. It's made because people who refuse to stand up for the Palestinian people and refuse to show the courage to stand up to the Israeli regime, they need to discredit those who are courageous and steadfast in the face of these genocidal monsters. Those who sit quietly and do their business and whose governments are unwilling to do anything, they justify their inaction by slandering others. The Iranian government has made more sacrifices, ironically, in the fight against drugs than any other country in the world. The biggest source of drugs for the last few decades, largely thanks to the regime in Washington, has been from Afghanistan. Iran has given the lives of thousands of police officers have been lost in the fight against these drug gangs in Afghanistan, which take their drugs and spread them throughout the world. And they were done largely with U.S. support. Under the U.S. occupation, and it became a big problem in Iran. We have large numbers of Iranians who have drug problems. And you've been to Iran, it has a very sophisticated program to help people uh, overcome drug addiction. So that's absolute nonsense. Iran was providing Hezbollah with its source of income. That's why Iran is sanctioned. If Iran knew that Hezbollah was making its money through the drug trade, then we don't have to help them anymore. That, of course, is nonsense too. The purest of the pure are Hezbollah. They are the ones who sacrifice their lives for the sake of another people. That's extraordinary. The Palestinian people have courageously stood their ground in Gaza and elsewhere, but they're fighting for themselves and their dignity and honor. The, the resistance in Lebanon is fighting for a people that many are telling them you shouldn't be fighting for. They're making the ultimate sacrifice, sacrificing themselves and their families for others. That is what our commanders in Tehran did when they are martyred by the Israeli regime. That is what Ansar Allah does. They sacrifice for others. And then to slander them like this, it just shows how empty and soulless these takfiris are.
So, during your explanation about the drug issue that Iran is experiencing because of its proximity to Afghanistan's border, uh, there was an internet connection issue, and so you were freezing. But I think, just to re-summarize for the audience who might be interested in this and unaware of it, Iran does have a significant drug addiction issue, a pretty high percentage. I think maybe 3 or 5% or something like that. I might be exaggerating
Well,
numbers, but
uh, uh, yeah, I don't think it's that high because there are different ways of interpreting addiction. I mean, addiction. Like for example, some use opium, but it's very different from, let's say, using heroin. I don't know much about drugs, but in any case, Iran does have a significant problem because it is right beside where they're produced, and so it's very cheap because it's next door. The drugs that go all the way to Europe and the United States and elsewhere, they're more costly because of the distance. So Iran has made many sacrifices in fighting drug. It has made more sacrifices than any other country in the world because Iran has lost many police officers, many thousands of police officers over the last 3 or 4 decades in fighting the drug trade. So for Iran, which has made the biggest sacrifices and which is also a very extensive healthcare network to return to help people who are addicted be saved from addiction. Iran has which done makes all these sacrifices and has all these makes all these efforts to solve the problem. Then for these people to make such outrageous accusations about Iran and Hezbollah is really too much. I think instead of criticizing Iran, they should look at some of the clips that are coming out from Suweida and what these people are talking about giving the first. There's a clip that I tweeted where one of these Takfiris said, "I'm going to give the first Druze woman as a gift to this old sheikh who was beside him," or when they gun down people or force them to jump off of the terrace in a high-rise building. They should look at the footage of those clips instead of making slanderous accusations about others. As a Muslim, these Takfiris who believe that they are pure Islam, and they are as far from Islam as anyone can be, and they have nothing to do with Islam. They are not Islam. They are products of Western intelligence agencies. But if they really think they're so pure, then instead of slandering others, uh, they should regulate their language as advised by the Prophet.
peace be upon him. Professor Marandi, thank you for the clarification and thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you educating our audience.
Thank you for having me.
Trust nothing. No